Alright, so today we're doing Chapter 19, Part 2, which is going to be blood pressure, or hemodynamics. So we're going to cover some definitions. The first one to cover is blood flow. The textbook definition of blood flow is going to be the blood flowing through vessel or organ or entire circulatory system in a given period of time. It will be measured in milliliters per minute. So the gist of it is it's the flow rate, how much blood's going through a certain area. Our next one is going to be blood pressure. Blood pressure is going to be the force per unit area exerted by the blood against a vessel wall, and it's is described by millimeters of mercury. So that's going to be your blood pressure when you go to the doctor's office and they check your blood pressure. Blood pressure will obviously be highest in your arteries, and it will be lowest in your veins. We'll go in depth with that in a couple slides from now. We'll be looking at a chart that shows us where blood pressure is going to be the highest and where it's going to be the lowest and why. Our next one is going to be resistance. Resistance is going to be the stuff that is trying to stop blood from moving through your blood vessels. So that's going to be the friction between blood and the vessel wall. Back in the heart chapter, we spoke of the endocardium, or the endothelial layers. Those will be layers of cells found within the heart, which is the endocardium or endothelium within the blood vessels, that will actually help to decrease friction of the blood with the heart and vessel walls. So with resistance, there's going to be three main sources. There's blood viscosity, blood vessel length, and blood vessel diameter. So blood viscosity would be how thick is your blood? Do you have a lot of water in the blood, or do you have a lot of other stuff in the blood? Think of it like if I have a cup of water and I try to pour out a cup of water, that's going to dump out very quickly. If I have a super thick a super thick blizzard from Dairy Queen, I go to dump it on your head, you won't even flinch probably, because you know that's going to be a really thick viscous substance. So it's not going to flow easily, so it would be hard for your heart to pump it, and it'd be hard for it to move through your blood vessels. Next one will be blood vessel length. This kind of makes sense. The further the length of the blood vessel, it's going to be harder to move the blood through. Kind of like if you're trying to move water through a hose, the longer the hose, it's going to be harder for the water to get to the very end of it. And then the last one that we'll speak of for this slide is going to be the blood vessel diameter. Smaller blood vessel diameter will create more friction, which would mean that the blood would likely move slower, or we'd have a slower flow rate. And larger blood vessel diameter would mean that we would likely have a faster flow rate. So the way I like to think of this is if I have like a bottle of water, a normal old bottle of water, like the little 1 pint bottles of water, and I try to dump it out, it's going to pour out pretty slow because it has a small top to it. Now let's take a gallon of milk that has a nice big hole on the top of it. I try to dump that thing out, it's going to pour out a lot more liquid in the same amount of time than the bottle of water will. Okay, so we're going to talk more about our flows, our pressures, and resistance. So the way we can calculate flow, or the flow of blood, is going to be by the change in pressure. This little triangle right here that I'm circling is called delta. That means change. So the change in pressure divided by the resistance. So we talked about the resistance can be blood viscosity, blood vessel length, or the diameter of the tube that the blood is passing through. So with our changes in pressure, we go wherever the pressure is the highest minus the pressure that is the lowest, and we'll divide it by the resistance. And once again, looking at it, we have viscosity, length, and diameter. So if you think once again to veins versus arteries, veins usually have a very large diameter versus arteries will have a little bit smaller diameter. So veins will have lower pressure versus arteries, which will have higher pressure. Here's just some easy ways to think of stuff. As your blood pressure increases, the flow rate increases. That kind of makes sense, right? If I take a bottle of water and I flip it over and it's pouring out, the water is going to be coming out at whatever speed. I take that same bottle of water, and while it's pouring out, I squeeze it. All of a sudden I increase the pressure in the bottle, and the water is going to start to flow a lot quicker. Resistance. So something we could talk about with resistance is depending on the diameter of the hole or the blood vessel, the lumen, which would be the hole for the blood vessel, that will determine one of our resistance factors. So if we increase resistance, we decrease blood flow. So if I have a smaller hole on my bottle top, that's going to let out a lot less water than if I have a larger hole on my bottle top. Or another example could be if I pour a cup of water, that's going to pour much more slowly than if I pour a cup of syrup, because that syrup will be more viscous, so it would increase the resistance. And pressure. You will have pressure build up when blood flow is going to be opposed by any of these resistance factors that we spoke of up here, which would include viscosity, blood vessel length, and blood vessel diameter. So with our systemic blood pressure, alright, blood pressure will be the highest in the aorta. Blood pressure will be the lowest in the right atrium. So the further you get from the left ventricle, blood pressure starts to drop. Alright, and as we return our way up all the way back to the right atrium, that's going to be the furthest, okay, for our systemic pump, then the blood pressure will be almost nil. It'll be very, very low. So we have two pressures. We have systolic pressure and diastolic pressure. So looking back at our heart lecture, we spoke of ventricular systole and ventricular diastole. So ventricular systole was when your ventricles were contracting. So as the ventricles contracted, they squeezed that blood, they shut the AV valves, and they built pressure. So pressure was building. And at the peak of their contraction, pressure is the highest. So we call that high pressure the systolic pressure, hence ventricular systole. Normally, you want that to be between about 100 and 120 millimeters of mercury. Diastolic pressure is going to be when the ventricles are relaxing. So we get that relax and the pressure in the ventricle drops. Since that's happening, there's no blood being forced into the arteries, so the pressure in the arteries will slowly start to taper off. That usually is going to fall somewhere between the range of 70 to 80 millimeters of mercury. Our next one is pulse pressure. All that is that's going to be what is the difference between our systolic and diastolic pressure, and then our mean arterial pressure, which you can see the equation for it here. We're not going to go very in depth with the mean arterial pressure, but you can see it represented on this graph right here. In your study guide, there is a portion of the study guide that is going to ask you where blood pressure is the highest and where blood pressure is the lowest. It's asking like arteries and veins and capillaries and stuff. You can pull that information off of here. I'd like you to have a general idea of the approximate pressures in those areas, but what I really want you to know is that blood pressure is the highest in the aorta. It starts to decrease in the distributing arteries. In the arterioles it decreases, in the capillaries it decreases, and the further we get from that left ventricle all the way to the vena cava, the pressure almost drops to zero. Another thing I want to take a moment to speak of right here is that check out the pressure right here in the capillaries or in your capillary bed. That blood pressure is usually low. It's usually somewhere between about 20 and 40 millimeters of mercury, and there's a couple of reasons behind that. First off, we're going to want the blood pressure to be high enough so we can force stuff out of the capillary beds, so we can force fluids and gases and nutrients and other molecules out of the capillary beds. But at the same time, we don't want that blood pressure to be too high, because we spoke of our capillaries being only 1 cell layer thick. So if that blood pressure raises too high in those capillary beds, it can cause them to rupture, and then those tissues aren't going to be getting any nutrients, and then those tissues can die. So we'd call that an ischemic event. Ischemia means there would be a lack of blood flow. And then going on further to the next little bullet down here, it just says veins, pulse pressure, phase out, BP lowering, low reflecting cumulative effects of peripheral resistance. Basically, the further you get from the left ventricle, which is our source of pressure, the less pressure you're going to have. As we spoke of the length of the blood vessel, the more length, the more resistance you get. So once we start getting into the vena cava, that blood has traveled quite a distance, and there's been enough resistance to drop the pressure significantly. Okay, so what are our factors affecting blood pressure? There are going to be 3 main factors. We'll have cardiac output, peripheral resistance, and blood volume. So our first one, which is cardiac output, we spoke of that in our lecture over heart rate. Okay, over, what was it called? It was regulation and output lecture was when we spoke of that. So that is our second part of chapter 18. So just to review, our cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate. So your stroke volume is going to be how much blood the ventricle is going to pump out with each beat of the heart, and your heart rate is going to be the amount of beats per minute by the heart. So what we end up getting here is going to be something that will be in some sort of volume of blood over unit time. It's usually milliliters per minute. And the reason for that is your heart rate is usually measured in minutes, and your stroke volume is usually measured in milliliters. Just to review, the normal stroke volume for a heart, or the average stroke volume for a left ventricle, will be 60 milliliters. Okay, so let's talk about here. I think this kind of makes sense. If we increase cardiac output, we should therefore increase blood pressure. So that's this bullet point right here. So as we increase cardiac output, we increase blood pressure. That kind of makes sense, right? If I'm pumping more blood, speaking of stroke volume, if I pump more blood out of the heart with each beat, that means the heart will have to work harder to pump out each portion of blood. So that will have to raise the heart rate. That will have to raise the blood pressure. Or heart rate, think about if you go and you do something strenuous. You walk upstairs, you take a run, you do some sort of exercise, your heart rate increases. And as your heart rate increases, most people know that your blood pressure increases. And if your heart rate gets really high, you can actually feel the increase in blood pressure. Okay, so the gist of it is you increase the cardiac output, which means more blood is flowing out of the heart, which means there's more blood in the vascular system. So we increase the volume, it's going to increase the blood pressure. Our next one will be peripheral resistance. So we said that can be the viscosity of the blood, the length of the blood vessel, or the diameter of the blood vessel. Looking back to our last lecture, we spoke of vasoconstriction, which is right here, and vasodilation, which is right here. So when you constrict or you contract a muscle, that muscle is going to shorten its length. So if we have vasoconstriction, vaso is in vasculature or blood vessel, and constriction, so we'll have vasoconstriction of that smooth muscle, so the diameter of the blood vessel would decrease. If we had vasodilation, the blood vessel diameter would increase. So once again, looking, if we have a bottle with a small hole, or vasoconstriction, the water is going to pour out really slowly. If we have a bottle with a larger hole in it, hence vasodilation, the water can pour out much quicker. This gets really useful with your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So your blood can distribute, so your body can distribute blood to the areas that need it most. For example, if you are getting chased by a bear that wants to eat you, it's not a good time for your body to be trying to send lots of blood to your stomach to absorb your meal from an hour ago. At this moment in time, it'd be good to have a sympathetic response, your fight or flight, and it'd be a good time to send all the blood to your muscles. So you get vasoconstriction of the blood vessels heading to the gut, and you get vasodilation of the blood vessels heading to the skeletal muscles, which are going to help you run away from that bear so you don't get eaten. Okay, so right here, vasoconstriction will increase the resistance, and vasodilation will decrease the resistance. So that can so if we want to increase blood flow to a certain area, we would vasodilate. If we want to decrease blood flow to an area, we would vasoconstrict. Okay, next one will be our blood volume. So blood volume can be under hormonal control. We will go in depth of the hormonal controls with blood volume in the kidney or renal chapter. That's chapters 25 and 26. So we'll go quite in depth of how that is all going to work. But the gist of it is the more volume, the more blood pressure. The less volume, the less blood pressure. The thing that's going to control your blood volume, or the amount of water in your blood, is going to be your kidneys. Their main job is to clean your plasma and to conserve however much of it you need. Okay, so let's look at these charts. You all know I love my charts. So we have factors of venous return. I think this is the first question I ask you. I'm circling it right here. I'm going to pull out this little pointer and I'm going to circle it on here. This is the first question I'm going to ask you on your study guide. So for this unit. So you want to know this. As you can see, I'm very smooth with this mouse here. Not. Anyways. So our factors are going to be our respiratory pump, our muscular pump, your venous smooth muscles, and your valves. So first off, respiratory pump. As I take a breath, my lungs expand. I have air coming into my lungs, and my chest cavity is only a certain size. So as my chest expands, I put pressure on all the veins in there. As I put pressure on the veins in there, it's going to push the blood into a certain direction. That blood is only going to continue in a direction towards the heart because we have valves that will prevent the blood from flowing backwards. So that brings us down to this number 4 right here. So the valves will be there to prevent the backflow of the blood. So it'll force the blood to go on and move towards the right atrium. Muscular pump will be a similar way. So as you stand up and walk around and contract your skeletal muscles, those guys are going to be putting pressure on the veins, and that will initiate blood flow towards the right atrium, and it won't be able to go backwards or regurgitate because of those valves. And then finally, we have smooth muscle. So we have a layer of smooth muscle inside of the veins, and that will be found in the tunica media, and as that constricts, it will increase the pressure and move the blood on its way, once again, back to the right atrium. So let's check out this chart. First thing that happens here, first thing that's going to happen here is decreased blood pressure will activate the cardiac centers in the medulla. Okay, so what does that mean? We want to decrease our parasympathetic activity. Looking back at heart chapter, you remember our parasympathetic activity was what kept our heart rate below 75, because our pacemaker from our SA node is set at 75. So our parasympathetic activity, rest and digest, tells our heart to calm down a little bit. So if your blood pressure drops, the medulla tells the parasympathetic activity, hey, not your time right now. We need some sympathetic activity. So we have increased sympathetic activity, and what that is going to lead to is increased heart rate, release of epinephrine. We spoke of epinephrine before with our sympathetic nervous system. If I was to make a loud sound and it scared you, that would increase your heart rate for a split second. Your pupils would dilate, your heart rate would go up, you'd perk up, you'd look around real quickly. If something happens to agitate you for a longer period of time, Then you're going to start getting epinephrine released into the blood, and that'll be like when somebody really upsets you, somebody cuts you off and you're driving and you're mad and you don't get over it and your heart rate's just going for a couple minutes. So the sympathetic activity initially is a nervous system response, which is almost instantaneous. It starts right away and it ends just as fast. Epinephrine would be a hormonal response, so that's going to be a little bit slower to start and it will last for a longer period of time. But once again, epinephrine is going to keep your heart rate increased. With the increased sympathetic activity, we will have increased contractility of the cardiac muscle, which means we will decrease our end systolic volume, which means we will increase the stroke volume. To review, our end systolic volume is the amount of blood left in the ventricle after it has contracted. So if we're doing that, that means we're going to be pumping more blood out of the ventricle, which means we're going to be able to get more blood to the tissues. Now over here we have our own little part of this chart, okay? We're going to increase venous return. With our increased venous return, that means that we're going to increase our end diastolic volume because we have more blood coming back to the heart. So if we have more blood coming back to the heart, we have more blood going into the ventricle. With the increased blood to the ventricle, we kick in that Frank-Starling's law. You remember we talked about the rubber band. You take the rubber band, you pull it back just a little bit, you'd let me snap you with it. You wouldn't care too much. You take a rubber band and I pull that sucker back right before it's going to break, you're not going to be very happy if I try to snap you with that. So that's that Frank-Starling's mechanism. The longer the fibers of the muscle in the ventricle, the more vigorous the contraction will be. Okay, so specific mechanisms affecting blood pressure. First off, venous return. So that kind of makes sense, right? As we increase our venous return, we're going to increase our end diastolic volume, which will increase our stroke volume because of Frank-Starling's mechanism. Neural controls. Okay. With our neural controls, we can have our sympathetic versus parasympathetic, right? If you get a sympathetic type of response, you're going to get generalized vasoconstriction going to your muscle, going to your gut, and you're going to get generalized vasodilation going to your skeletal muscles. But overall, your blood pressure will increase. Why? Because we're going to increase heart rate, and we're going to increase cardiac output. Hormonal controls. After peripheral affects the peripheral resistance. Why? Simply because of the blood volume. So the kidneys can control how much water you are going to retain or how much water you get rid of. And then the last one is going to be some chemical effects. But we'll talk about those in the coming slides. Okay, with our neural controls, we have our vasomotor centers and we have our cardiac centers. So your vasomotor centers will be that sympathetic. And in general, when you think sympathetic response, you're going to get vasoconstriction and you're going to get increased heart rate. If you inhibit the sympathetic response, we increase parasympathetic activity, you're going to get generalized vasodilation and decreased heart rate. So that would decrease our blood pressure. Okay, once again, we talked about the factors that will affect cardiac output a couple slides ago back here. Okay, and then parasympathetic centers, okay, those guys decrease our heart rate, sympathetic increase the heart rate. Okay, so here's another chart. So what's going on with this chart? Let me grab a little pen or highlighter here so we see what we're doing. So with our heart, first thing that's going to happen is we have baroreceptors. Baroreceptors will be found in the carotid sinuses and they'll be found in the aortic arch. Alright, if our blood pressure is increasing or decreasing, we're going to have different types of responses. So this chart shows us that our blood pressure is increasing. So we have our stimulus right here of increased blood pressure. As blood pressure moves above normal, we have our baroreceptors in our carotid sinus and aortic arch. So think of where the carotids are, your carotid arteries. Those are going to be your first branches off of your aorta, right? And your aortic arch. So those will be like blood's first getting into the system. We want to know what blood pressure is there. Why? Because it's going to be highest there. And whatever it is there, it's going to affect everything from there on out. So if our blood pressure is too high, we go to our cardio inhibitory center. We say decrease the sympathetic activity. Okay, and that's going to cause us to decrease heart rate, decrease contractility, and what will happen is we'll have less cardiac output. Also, what's going to happen is we're going to get vasodilation. With vasodilation, we increase the diameter of the blood vessels, and that will help drop our blood pressure. So in gist, we get decreased cardiac output, we get decreased resistance, and our blood pressure starts to taper off a little bit. So blood pressure decreases, decreases, decreases until it's in normal range. Now let's say that blood pressure goes below that normal range, we're going to get the opposite effects going on here. So my baroreceptors would see my blood pressure was too low, and we would go to our cardioactive centers, okay, and we would increase sympathetic activity, which would increase heart rate, and we'd get vasoconstriction, and we would get our blood pressure back up there where we wanted it to be. So that shows us right here, our declining blood pressure. Okay, as blood pressure declines, our baroreceptors pick it up. Brain senses blood pressure is decreasing. We increase sympathetic activity, increase heart rate, we vasoconstrict, so we are going to decrease the diameter and we'll increase the resistance. So that's going to increase our blood pressure. So we'll get increased cardiac output and resistance. Okay. Looking at our hormonal controls. So first thing with our hormonal controls, I want you guys to notice all of these hormones, these bottom 4 hormones here, these guys are all going to increase blood pressure in some way, shape, or form. The only hormone that you're going to have that we'll speak about in this class that will decrease your blood pressure is going to be this one right here, atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP. It is produced by the atria, and it will be a diuretic and a vasodilator. So it's going to make you pee, which means you're going to lose fluid, which means that you're going to have less blood volume. And it will cause vasodilation, so it will be taking pressure off of the blood, so we decrease blood pressure. Okay, adrenal medulla hormones. Okay, these are going to be our sympathetic type hormones, so we'll have our norepinephrine and epinephrine. And those guys are going to be increasing your heart rate and causing vasoconstriction. We have ADH, which is anti-diuretic hormone. So once again, a diuretic makes you pee. So when I hear anti-diuretic hormone, I think the anti-pee hormone. It makes you not pee. It makes it so you retain water. We get angiotensin II. We will go in depth of the way angiotensin II works and ACE inhibitors and how those work in the renal chapter. I'm not going to go into that with you guys right now, but we'll go into that in the renal chapter. But angiotensin II is going to be a vasoconstrictor. It's going to tell us to release aldosterone right here, and it's going to tell us to release antidiuretic. So can you see how that's going to do a little bit of everything? That's going to be the strongest hormone, this angiotensin II, to increase blood pressure. That'll be the strongest hormone we have that'll increase it. Aldosterone, that is going to tell your body to retain salt or sodium. And the gist of what you'll hear me say over and over and over again in the renal chapter is where sodium goes, water follows. So if we retain sodium, water follows. If you ever talk to, you find it usually more with women than men, but you talk to ladies and they eat a salty meal and they'll say, "Ooh, my fingers are swelling, my ring is stuck on my hand," or they'll just say, "I can't eat that, I swell, I feel bloated and gross from it." And it is literally, they're swelling. They have more salt in their system and they're retaining water. Okay, just to go over these hormones again. So hormones are going to affect our cardiac output. Alright, right here, cardiac output. So hormones are going to affect it. Those will be epinephrine and norepinephrine. So increase heart rate, increase contractility, increase cardiac output. Hormones that'll affect our peripheral resistance. Angiotensin II, if you remember, we said that was a strong vasoconstrictor. Alright, our antidiuretic hormone, we said that that is going to help you retain.
Hello, sir.
Hey.
So you see that?
And, oh. Okay, our next hormone on the list are going to be, once again, our epinephrine and norepinephrine. So, epinephrine and norepinephrine, on the past slide, we spoke of how those guys are going to have sympathetic type responses, and those will cause vasoconstriction. Okay, blood volume. So, which hormones are going to be affecting our blood volume? We'll have our atrionatriuretic peptide, our aldosterone, cortisol, and ADH. Atrionatriuretic peptide we spoke of as being the only hormone that we'll talk about in here that will decrease your blood pressure. So if we're going to decrease your blood pressure, we're going to increase urination. We're going to be a diuretic. So it'll decrease the amount of salt and help you lose water. Aldosterone, cortisol, and ADH will all have the opposite effects. So what those guys will be doing is they will help with increasing water retention. Aldosterone will help you conserve sodium, and as we said, where sodium goes, water follows. And ADH, antidiuretic, means that you will decrease the formation of urine, so we will increase our water retention overall. Okay, moving on, we're going to have some endothelial derived factors. What those guys are going to do is those will be released if we have decreased blood flow to a certain area, and what those will cause is localized vasoconstriction. Once again, vasoconstriction will help us increase blood pressure, and that will be a local increase in blood pressure. Nitric oxide is going to help with, which is right here, NO, is going to help with localized vasodilation. Vasodilation is going to help increase blood flow to an area. So since we're going to have increased blood flow to an area, there are some sources that have been talking about how releases of nitric oxide can help with localized healing. And then our inflammatory chemicals. So we have histamines, prostacyclins, kinins. These guys are all going to be potent vasodilators. So these guys are going to increase blood flow to an area so you can have some sort of an immune response like we talked about in our immune chapter. So you get inflammation, you get increased blood, you got nutrients coming to the area, so we can really help heal, we can really help attack invaders to a certain area. Okay, blood pressure. So your blood pressure is going to be measuring the pressure of the blood in your atria, literally in your atria, in your arteries. So low blood pressure would be if somebody was to have a systolic pressure of below 100 millimeters of mercury. Right here. People with lower blood pressure or hypotension, they actually have a tendency to live a little bit longer because their blood vessels aren't getting beaten up at this constant rate that people with higher blood pressure do. Another thing that could be going on there could be malnutrition. They don't have enough sodium, they don't have enough other electrolytes in their body to actually maintain their full blood pressure. Next one's going to be hypertension. So if somebody has hypertension, their blood pressure is too high. So what we'll want to do is we'll want to decrease their blood pressure. Okay, hypertension is somebody whose blood pressure is above 140/90. A lot of the medications on the market today, the way those are going to be affecting blood pressure is they're going to affect these hormones, our angiotensin II, our antidiuretic, our epinephrine, norepinephrine. So we'll be having some sort of effect on those hormones, and what the end result we're going to want from those is to decrease the blood pressure. Okay, we have our tissue perfusion. Basically what tissue perfusion is how much blood is passing through a certain area at a given amount of time. Okay? You want your tissues to be perfused because you're going to want delivery of oxygen, nutrients, and the removal of waste. That's the most important thing there, is getting the goods to the area and getting the junk out of the area. So another area, so this would be with the systemic pump. With our respiratory pump, that'll be the blood flowing to the lungs. So the important thing we're going to want to happen in the lungs is we're going to want to dump off our carbon dioxide and pick up fresh oxygen. Okay? Kind of makes sense with the absorption of nutrients in the digestive tract. You eat your foods, we want to take in all the good stuff from the foods and be able to deliver it to the body. So that's where that's going to happen. And with the kidneys, we're going to want to have enough blood pressure going through the kidneys so we can force our plasma through the filtration membrane, and we're going to want it to be able to drop low enough so we can suck back in the water that we want to keep. So our next statement here says that velocity is inversely related to total cross-sectional area. What that means is the speed of blood traveling through your blood vessels is going to be the opposite or inversely related to the total cross-sectional area of blood vessels. Here's the deal. Your aorta. Your aorta is one large blood vessel. It is the largest blood vessel in your body, but since it's the largest blood vessel in your body, there's only one of it. So it's like its total cross-sectional area, or its total diameter, is very, very small. I mean, it's just a couple centimeters. But as we have more and more arteries and they start dividing and we get into our arteries out here, their cross-sectional area increases. Okay? As the cross-sectional area increases, that means there's going to be able to be a higher flow of blood rate. We start going into arterioles, which are little arteries. We have even more of those. So if we have more of those, then that's going to help decrease our, sorry, I said this backwards. It's going to decrease the flow rate. And as we get into our arterioles, the flow rate decreases even more. Then we finally get here in our capillaries. If you see here in the capillaries, blood is flowing very slowly. The reason why we want the blood to flow very slowly in your capillaries is going to be because we want to give it a chance to do the gas and nutrient exchange. If the blood is just traveling through there at a very, very rapid pace, it's not going to have a chance for the exchange of nutrients and gases to occur. Once again, you are going to find in your study guide a chart that is asking you the relative flow rate within the blood vessels. This is it right here. Here, I'll circle it for you even. So this is it right here, what we're looking for. Relative flow rate. Okay? I want you just to realize that it's going to be the highest in the aorta, second highest in the arteries, third in the arterioles. Okay? Then we go our veins, our vena cava, our venules, and our capillaries.
And me too.
Hey, guess.
Who's first? I think you're playing quicker.
Guys.
Oh, she said this last time.
All right, back to recording. No, I haven't done it. I wasn't doing it. I was just starting. That's why I was saying it out loud. Okay, so autoregulation. Autoregulation is going to be the adjustment.
I'll hold my popcorn tomorrow that we'll share tomorrow.
Okay, so autoregulation, sorry about that. The automatic adjustment of blood flow to each tissue in proportion to its needs. This kind of makes sense, right? If I just eat a large meal and I am sitting down on the couch relaxing, I'm going to have increased blood flow to my gut. Why? So I can help break down this stuff and I can help absorb all the nutrients that I just took in. If I am getting up and I'm taking a run and I run for a couple hours, I'm going to decrease blood flow to my gut, and I'm going to increase blood flow to all my skeletal muscle because that is in dire need of oxygen and nutrients. So the gist of the way this works, if you have low nutrients or low oxygen, you get increased blood flow. Alright, so if we want to increase the blood flow to an area, we'd vasodilate. If we want to decrease blood flow to an area, we'd vasoconstrict. So what are some of our metabolic controllers? Some of them are chemical. Okay, some substances can tell us to have immediate vasodilation, okay, like our inflammatory chemicals that we spoke of earlier. Okay, some substances get your body to release the nitric oxide. As we said, that is a potent vasodilator, and there's been some research looking at that with healing effects to help increase blood flow to a certain area. Okay, and other things such as potassium and hydrogen, and those guys can also help out with our vasodilation. We have some stuff that is vasoconstrictors. We talked about those guys can be locally released to, we talked about endothelians, which can be released by your blood vessels to locally cause vasoconstriction. And then our myogenic controls. So they can respond directly to passive stretch. So if a blood vessel starts to stretch out, it will actually vasoconstrict in response, so it doesn't stretch out to the point where it's going to rupture. Or it can respond in reduced stretch, okay, and it can over vasodilate, so it would once again vasoconstrict. Vasomotion, this it is what it is. It is the slow intermittent flow of blood through capillaries, will reflect the action of precapillary sphincters in response to local auto-regulatory controls. What does that mean? So if you think, guys, here, and I'm going to get something. Oops. So in our last lecture, I showed you guys this thing, and I showed you these precapillary sphincters. The gist of it is in front of a capillary bed, there's going to be numerous precapillary sphincters. So let's say I'm exercising, and this is a capillary bed to a skeletal muscle. All these precapillary sphincters would pretty much be relaxed or vasodilated. Why? Because we want to increase blood flow to that tissue so we can have more oxygen delivery and you can go on with your current activities. Now let's say that I'm sleeping and I didn't work those muscles out much that day and they didn't need any tissue repair. Maybe I would just leave one of these precapillary sphincters open. Why? Because it needs a little bit of blood flow, but just enough for the tissue to stay alive. It doesn't need a lot of blood flow because you're having any sort of crazy strenuous activity. Okay, let's go back to our other lecture here. We're almost done. Alright, so capillary exchange between blood and interstitial space through diffusion. Okay, so next one we got our capillary dynamics. So we got some different pressures I want you guys to know about. The first one is going to be hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure is going to be the pressure of the blood against the blood vessel wall. So the pressure of the fluid against the vessel wall. Colloidal osmotic pressure is going to be the force opposing the hydrostatic pressure. So that would be our osmotic pressure. So that's going to be the stuff trying to keep blood in the blood vessels. Alright, so when I think of this stuff, when I think of osmotic versus hydrostatic pressures, I think of hydrostatic pressure as the pressure forcing fluid out of the blood vessel. I think of osmotic pressure as the pressure keeping fluid inside of that blood vessel. So let's think of it this way. The arterial end, your hydrostatic pressure is going to be greater than your osmotic pressure. Therefore, fluid leaves the capillary beds. The venous end, osmotic pressure is going to be greater than hydrostatic pressure, so fluid will re-enter. So think of it this way. If I have a delivery truck coming to my house, I'm the first house in the morning that this delivery truck is coming to, and I ordered a new washer and dryer. That truck is filled to the brim. It would make no sense for the truck driver to come to my house, pick up my old washer and dryer, and try to stick it on the full truck. So what will they do? They'll come to the house, they'll drop off the new washer and dryer, then they'll grab the old one and put it on the truck because there's room. So if you think of it this way, the arterial end, hydrostatic pressure is going to be greater, osmotic pressure will be lower. So we dump off the stuff first, arterial end, and then and then the venous end, osmotic pressure gains, hydrostatic pressure drops, so fluid will re-enter. So we'll pick up all the junk then. Here's a little diagram. So this shows us, so this is going to show us the arterial end, and this is going to show us the venous end. So here we have our hydrostatic pressure, which is high, and our osmotic pressure, okay, which is slightly lower. So my hydrostatic pressure is about 35, my osmotic pressure is about 25. So hydrostatic pressure is high. Why? I have a lot of fluid in the blood vessel. So what happens? I push out all that fluid here on the arterial end, and now all of a sudden I don't have a lot of fluid once I get over the venous end. So my hydrostatic pressure dropped. Okay, my hydrostatic pressure dropped, and my hydrostatic pressure is lower than my osmotic pressure. So my osmotic pressure forces us to suck in fluids and nutrients, and then we pick up our goods, or we pick up the waste products. Okay, that is the end. Here's the stuff we're doing in lab this week.